In mid-March 2026, for nearly 11 million people across the island of Cuba, the lights simply went out. The national power grid suffered a complete and sudden collapse. This blackout triggered a humanitarian crisis that paralyzed the entire nation. Without electricity, the water pumps that supply major cities stopped working. Hospitals were forced to suspend non-emergency surgeries, and across most regions, citizens are now living through 15 to 20-hour blackouts every single day. Frustrated citizens are pouring into the streets for spontaneous protests, banging pots and pans in what are known as cacerolazos across Havana and Morón. It is a sharp escalation of an ongoing trend where roughly 10% of the population has already fled the island in recent years. While the island has faced decades of economic decline, the total failure of the grid has brought the functions of the state to a standstill. The physical infrastructure keeping the country alive has been decaying for decades. Most of Cuba's power plants are over 40 years old, and the state lacks the spare parts required to maintain them. This decay stems from soft budget constraints within the state-controlled economy, a system where government enterprises lack strict financial accountability. Instead of upgrading the aging electrical grid, the state directed massive investments into luxury tourist hotels that now sit largely empty. The agricultural sector faced similar neglect. By failing to invest in domestic food production, the government forced the island into a reliance on imported goods and the goodwill of foreign allies to feed its citizens. This internal rot created a systemic fragility. The entire nation became a house of cards, highly vulnerable to an external shock. To keep its failing grid operational, Havana has relied on subsidized oil shipments from foreign political allies, most recently Venezuela. That lifeline vanished in January 2026, following a United States military operation in Venezuela that removed Nicolás Maduro from power. Without Maduro, Cuba hasn't received a major fuel shipment in 3 months. The island is currently surviving on a mix of domestic natural gas and Chinese-funded solar farms, which only cover about 40% of the country's energy needs. The loss of their primary energy patron stripped away Havana's final safety net, leaving a weakened economy defenseless against a new geopolitical offensive. In late January 2026, President Donald Trump signed a sweeping executive order. This move shifted U.S. policy from a trade embargo to a strategy of direct economic warfare. This map shows how the secondary sanctions framework operates, a policy where the U.S. penalizes third-party countries for doing business with a sanctioned nation. The U.S. now threatens a 15% tariff on any country, such as Mexico or Russia, that attempts to send oil to Cuba. The enforcement is both physical and financial. The U.S. Navy has intercepted tankers carrying oil, while international banks now refuse to process Cuban transactions to avoid steep U.S. fines, making it nearly impossible for Havana to buy food on the open market. The final layer of isolation relies on Cuba's presence on the state sponsor of terrorism list. This designation automatically triggers financial restrictions and prevents travelers who visit Cuba from using the U.S. Visa Waiver Program, known as ESTA, cutting off vital travel revenue. This multi-layered blockade operates as a geopolitical vice, engineered to starve the island of the fuel and capital it needs to survive. As traditional allies retreat, China has remained Cuba's biggest remaining lifeline. Beijing is currently building 92 solar parks across the island to reduce the need for oil, while simultaneously shipping 60,000 tons of rice to help provide basic food security. Russia, on the other hand, has significantly reduced its actual oil shipments, actively avoiding the new financial penalties imposed by the United States. These lifelines are mathematically insufficient. Building solar infrastructure takes years, and limited food deliveries cannot immediately power a collapsed national grid. The scale of this blackout has forced the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, to the negotiating table. Behind closed doors, Havana is engaged in high-stakes talks with the Trump administration. This ledger shows the grand bargain. U.S. demands for lifting the oil blockade include Díaz-Canel's resignation, releasing 700 political prisoners, and a market economy. In response, Havana offered unthinkable concessions, allowing Cubans abroad to own businesses and inviting SBI security investigations. The Cuban government is offering ideological surrenders that abandon core communist tenets simply to turn the lights back on. Experts see three distinct paths forward for the island. The first is a friendly takeover, where the U.S. provides massive oil and food aid in exchange for free elections monitored by the United Nations. The second scenario is the Vietnam model. Under this path, the Communist Party retains political power, but fully embraces a capitalist economy to attract American tourism and investment. The final scenario is a total collapse. If the talks fail, the military may step in to manage a transition, attempting to suppress a full-scale civil uprising while the country remains in the dark. The structures that maintained the status quo for 6 decades have failed to keep the power on. Whether the path forward involves elections, markets, or a military-led transition, the island is being forced to transform in the dark.